All right, today on The Explainer, we're chasing a ghost that's been hiding for 137 years. We're diving deep into one of history's most notorious cold cases, the identity of Jack the Ripper, and we're going to see how modern science might have finally unmasked him. You know, for a mystery like Jack the Ripper, you'd think the big break would come from some dark, foggy alley in the 19th century, right? Well, you'd be wrong. For this story, that pivotal moment happened over 100 years later in a modern auction house. So here's the big question we're tackling. After more than a century of total silence, has science actually done it? Has it unmasked Jack the Ripper? We're going to explore some pretty groundbreaking DNA evidence that points to one specific man, and also the intense, and I mean intense, controversy that still swirls around this case. Okay, first things first. To even begin to understand a killer like this, you have to understand the world that created him. So let's go back to the East End of London, 1888. Welcome to Whitechapel, a place that people at the time literally described as hell on earth. I mean, just try to picture this. You've got nearly 1 million people crammed into these disgusting, rotting buildings. And then there was the fog. The famous London fog wasn't just some picturesque mist. It was this thick, poisonous, yellow soup of coal smoke and pollution from the river. It was so dense, you often couldn't even see your own hand in front of your face. For a predator, it was the perfect cover. And we have to remember, these weren't just names on a list. They weren't characters in a horror story. They were real women. Mary Ann, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary Jane. They were mothers and wives, mostly in their 40s, just completely worn down by a hard life, trying to survive one more night. And that desperation, that made them vulnerable. So while the public and the newspapers were going absolutely wild, suspecting everyone from gentleman doctors to members of the royal family, the police, well, they had a very different and very real suspect in their sights. They weren't chasing phantoms. And here's where it gets really interesting. This is from a secret internal memo written by one of the highest-ranking officers at Scotland Yard, Chief Constable Melville Macnaghten. He named Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant, as one of only 3 credible suspects. He wrote that Kosminski had a great hatred of women and strong homicidal tendencies. This wasn't public gossip. This was the police's private theory. And if that wasn't enough, look at this. This is the closest thing we have to a smoking gun from the original investigation. The head of the entire case, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, secretly scribbled this definitive note in the margin of his personal book. Kosminski was the suspect. The man in charge was privately convinced he knew who the killer was. So who was this guy? Not some criminal mastermind or a member of the aristocracy. He was a troubled 23-year-old immigrant working as a hairdresser living right in the heart of Whitechapel. He was known to be mentally unwell, plagued by hallucinations, and held a deep-seated hatred for women. And here's the kicker. His own family had him committed to an asylum in 1891, which is right when the Ripper murders just stopped. So the police had their man, but they had absolutely no proof. Nothing they could take to a trial. The case went cold for over a century. That is, until a single piece of physical evidence resurfaced. And that piece of evidence is this, a 7-foot-long silk shawl. Now, the story behind it is pretty wild. It was supposedly found on the ground right next to the body of Catherine Eddowes. The story goes that a police sergeant took it from the scene as a morbid souvenir for his wife. She was, as you can imagine, horrified and stored it away, unwashed, for generations. It basically became a biological time capsule, just waiting to be opened. I mean, just look at this journey. From a crime scene in 1888, it passes through families, to collectors, to an antiques dealer, until an author named Russell Edwards buys it at an auction in 2007. This piece of fabric was just waiting for technology to finally catch up and unlock its secrets. So Edwards gets this shawl, and he takes it to Dr. Jirailo Kohalainen. Now, this guy is a geneticist, but he's special. He's an expert at pulling tiny bits of data from ancient degraded samples, the kind of stuff that most scientists would just dismiss as totally useless. They decided to focus on something called mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. Think of it like a genetic time traveler. Unlike the DNA that gets all mixed up between your parents, mtDNA is passed down almost perfectly intact just from mother to child. It's incredibly tough, and it's the perfect tool for cracking a really, really old case like this. So, the process was basically a two-step verification. Step 1, prove the shawl was authentic. To do that, they'd match DNA from bloodstains on it to a living relative of the victim, Catherine Eddowes. Step 2, if that worked, they'd try to identify the attacker by matching other genetic material left behind to a living relative of their main suspect, Aaron Kosminski. And the results? They were absolutely stunning. 100%. First, the blood was a perfect match to Catherine Eddowes' descendant. That proved the shawl was the real deal. Then, the other trace samples. They came back as a 100% match to the maternal line of Aaron Kosminski. So just like that, everything converged. The old police records, the timeline of the murders, the suspect's profile, and now modern genetic evidence. It all pointed a steady, unwavering finger at one man, Aaron Kosminski. But, and you knew there was a but coming, right? As soon as these findings were published, the critics came out swinging. This was far from case closed.
And here's the central debate. The case for Kosminski is compelling. You've got mTNA matches to both the victim and the suspect's family, and it lines up with the police reports. But the case against the evidence is also really strong. You've got major doubts about the shawl's origin story, a huge risk of contamination, and the fact that this type of DNA just isn't unique.
Yeah, the experts pointed out some huge problems. We can't actually verify that whole story about the shawl. It was handled by who knows how many people over 100 years. And maybe the biggest criticism, mtDNA isn't like a fingerprint. Thousands of people in London at that time could have shared the same general maternal profile as Kosminski. Even the guy who invented DNA fingerprinting was skeptical. So all of this leaves us in a really fascinating, but also incredibly frustrating position. We're caught right between groundbreaking science and some very legitimate historical doubt. Let's be clear, there is no doubt that this genetic link to Aaron Kosminski, the prime suspect of the lead investigator, is a monumental breakthrough. It is the strongest piece of evidence ever put forward in this case. However, without a perfect chain of custody for that shawl, and with the known limitations of the genetic evidence, that standard of proof you need to definitively say case closed, well, it just hasn't been met. So what's the takeaway here? Is a 137-year-old legend finally solved? Or is the real Ripper still laughing at us from the shadows? Ultimately, science has given us a name, a face, and a powerful new chapter. But history reminds us that some mysteries, well, they may never truly be laid to rest.